It's late. The kind of late where the wind is just a suggestion and the world has turned blue at the edges. You're standing near Reykjavik harbor in the year 1915, and everything smells faintly of salt, fish, and political indecision. The lamps glow dim behind lace-curtained windows, and the wooden houses, painted cheerful colors to make up for the weather, tilt slightly, as if bracing for the next strong opinion. Tonight, it's quiet. You're not going anywhere. You've already taken off your boots, your thick wool socks, and the last of your outdoor responsibilities. The kettle's on. There's something vaguely vegetable simmering in it, and you're trying not to think about the fact that as of this year, beer is officially banned. But here's the twist, vodka is still perfectly fine. Yes, really. Welcome to Iceland, where logic is flexible but the climate is not. Before we begin, a small, sleepy reminder. If you're enjoying these unusually sober tales, go ahead and like this video, subscribe, and, should you feel inspired, leave a comment with your location and local time. It's oddly soothing knowing where people are dozing off from. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. You probably won't make it through this day, and that's okay. You light a lamp, not because you need it, but because the flicker feels familiar. Icelandic evenings in early spring are oddly in between. Not quite dark, not quite day. A sky with no clear opinion. The same could be said of Iceland's parliament, the Althing, which, after much soul-searching and lobbying, has just outlawed all alcohol. Sort of. Here's your historical fact. In 1915, Iceland banned all alcoholic beverages in a wave of early 20th century temperance sweeping the globe. But the ban had a peculiar loophole. Strong spirits were later re-legalized in the 1930s for trade reasons. Yet beer remained illegal until 1989. That's 74 years of beer prohibition. Why? Well, beer was seen as a gateway to full-scale drinking culture, too casual, too popular, too dangerous. Vodka, meanwhile, was considered medicinal, ceremonial, and, conveniently, exportable. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some Icelanders during this period poured non-alcoholic beer into their vodka to simulate a pint. It was called a bjorliki, literally beer-like, and it tasted about as inspiring as it sounds. You wrap yourself in a scratchy wool blanket. Not for warmth, you're indoors, but for principle. You stare at your mug of hot moss tea, an acquired taste. The window fogs over, and somewhere, behind the gently baffled laws of a young, fiercely independent nation, a quiet rebellion bubbles. But not beer. Not yet. You wake to gulls. They're always yelling. They have no volume control. Somewhere near the docks, two are arguing over a sandwich crust from a fisherman's lunch. Their opinions are sharp, declarative, and extremely unbeer-like. You stretch. You're in a modest flat above a bakery, and the smell of sourdough filters up through the floorboards. The ceiling is low, the furniture handmade, and your radiator hisses like it disapproves of everything you've ever done. You pull on your thick knit sweater, hand-spun, uneven, loyal, and glance at the cabinet. Inside, nestled behind a jar of rhubarb jam and a tin of pickled herring, is your one legal indulgence, Brennivin. Black Death, the locals call it. A clear, caraway-flavored schnapps. Potent, unapologetic. So yes, beer is banned. But Brennivin?
Pour Frilly.
This is Iceland, 1922. And no one seems entirely sure what's going on. Here's your historical fact. Despite the beer ban, Icelandic pharmacies were allowed to dispense strong alcohol for medical purposes, which meant that by the mid-1920s, many respectable citizens had mysteriously developed long-term, treatable illnesses that only vodka could soothe. You open the door and step outside. The sky is low. The streets are wet. You pass a line of bundled children kicking a deflated football near the church. A horse trots by with an expression that says, "Not again." And you head toward the local cafe, not for coffee, but for gossip. And maybe an illegal pint. Here's your obscure tidbit. During Iceland's beer ban, some pubs quietly served imported soup, a wink and nod term for smuggled beer, poured into teacups, served with biscuits, and consumed with the delicacy of international espionage. Historians still debate whether the teacups were a clever disguise, or just all they had clean. At the cafe, someone slides you a ceramic mug under the table. It smells faintly of hops and boldness. You take a sip. Still illegal. Still warm. Still better than moss tea. You're walking home, and the wind has picked up again. It doesn't blow. It announces. It whips around corners, rattles shutters, lifts the hems of coats, and occasionally repositions hats in new postal codes. In Iceland, this is just considered weather, not remarkable, not dramatic, just participatory. You clutch your groceries, turnips, dark rye, and a suspiciously labeled tonic, and head uphill toward your flat. The clouds are contemplating rain. You can tell by the way they lean. The beer ban has been in effect for nearly a decade now, and it shows. Not in the streets, those remain clean, orderly, and vaguely damp, but in the jokes, the workarounds, the polite smuggling strategies baked into the culture like cloves in Christmas bread. Here's your historical fact. After spirits were re-legalized in 1935 due to trade pressure, particularly from Spain, which threatened to cut off wine exports, beer remained prohibited. Spanish wine was politically useful. Danish beer? Too tempting. Too casual. You arrive home and light a lamp. The glow spreads across your little desk, across your unopened mail, your borrowed poetry volume, your tiny jar of contraband Bavarian hops. You're not a criminal, just historically inconvenient. Down the street, a neighbor is making music. A harmonium wheezes through a folk song about a man who falls in love with a glacier. It's a metaphor, probably. You sip your tonic, tastes of vodka and regret. Here's your obscure tidbit. During Prohibition, some Icelanders brewed near beer at home using rye bread, yeast, and old family recipes that doubled as excuses. Oh no, officer, this isn't alcohol. This is heritage. Scholars still debate whether these near beers ever reached 2% alcohol, or if they were simply embraced for the placebo and the performance. You sit back. The wind knocks once at the window, then moves on. The stove hums. The harmonium sighs, and you begin to wonder what beer even tasted like anymore. Morning arrives with fog. Thick, quiet, and committed. It wraps around rooftops and sleeps in alleyways. The church tower disappears halfway up, as though even it needs a break. You brew your coffee slowly, boiled, black, and served with a hard biscuit that dares you to enjoy it. Today, you're meeting a friend who knows a guy who knows a guy. In beer-banned Iceland, this is a reasonable sentence. You bundle up, lace your boots, and set off across town. The streets are sleepy, the buildings weather-softened. Somewhere, A cat surveys its kingdom from a rooftop like a furry, indifferent deity. Your destination? The harbor, and specifically, a Danish fishing vessel recently docked. Here's your historical fact. Throughout the mid-20th century, foreign ships were allowed to dock in Icelandic ports with their own alcohol on board, and it wasn't uncommon for Icelanders to visit these ships for entirely social reasons. Sometimes they brought fish, sometimes favors, always curiosity. The boat smells like salt and possibility. Your friend nods to the first mate, who nods back like this is very normal, and suddenly you're in a narrow galley being offered a warm, frothy glass of something amber and ancient. It's beer. Real beer. Brewed in Denmark. Smuggled in without drama. Served in a mug with a chip in the rim. You sip. It's cold, slightly bitter, and entirely illegal. You've never felt so polite. Here's your obscure tidbit. Icelanders coined a nickname for these friendly visits to foreign ships, beer cruises, a practice that became so common, it caused minor diplomatic concerns. Historians still debate whether the government truly didn't notice, or simply preferred not to. You thank your hosts, step back into the fog, and carry a small, fizzy memory in your coat pocket. The kind of memory that tastes a bit like freedom. And hops, you decide to walk home a different way. There's something about beer, specifically the absence of it, that's turned ordinary streets into quiet conspiracies. You turn down a narrow lane lined with turf-roofed homes and carved wooden doors. One of them creaks open just enough for an old woman to toss out breadcrumbs for the birds, or possibly send a coded message. In Iceland, it's hard to tell. The wind, being nosy, is back. It carries the scent of seaweed and old paint and something faintly herbal. Maybe the neighbor's digestive tonic. Maybe his boot polish. Possibly both. Your mind drifts to when this all started. Here's your historical fact. Iceland's 1908 national referendum was the first step toward full prohibition. The public vote, prompted by decades of temperance campaigning, narrowly passed, leading to a 1915 law banning all alcohol. Spirits, wine, and beer all gone in a single sweep. And yet, like most sweeping reforms, it forgot the corners. Like medicinal brandy, or diplomatic trade wines, or fishermen with large coats and empty thermoses. You stop at a tiny post office that also serves as a general store, a part-time knitting cooperative, and, rumor has it, a black market distributor of Spanish red. Inside, the clerk is folding letters and humming something that might be a hymn or might be a protest song. You ask for stamps. You get stamps. And a small, clinking package wrapped in newspaper. You pay in silence, with exact change, as if this is a normal transaction. Here's your obscure tidbit. In the 1940s, some Icelandic postal workers were found to be distributing wine via the national mail system, disguised in parcels marked ceramics or hair oil. One particularly inventive smuggler even used hollowed-out books. Historians still debate whether this was organized, tolerated, or simply misfiled. You tuck the bundle under your coat and leave. The street outside is the same as ever. Cobblestones, gulls, a man fixing his roof with more confidence than tools. But everything feels warmer now. Just a little. Night falls early in Reykjavik. Not out of spite, just habit. By late afternoon, the light is slanted and philosophical. You've put your package of contraband Spanish wine beside the stove, just to take the chill off, and now you're watching the condensation bead along the glass like it's considering a better life. You sit and think about what it means when a country bans something soft. Not dangerous, not volatile, just popular. Here's your historical fact. By the 1970s, beer remained the only type of alcohol still banned in Iceland, despite rising tourism, increasing imports, and the visible irony of liquor stores selling vodka beside beer-flavored soda. The government insisted beer was still too closely tied to drunkenness, to brawls, to British naval behavior, a concern left over from World War II occupation. Meanwhile, wine was cultured, spirits were medicinal, but beer was for fun, and fun was suspicious. You pour yourself a mug of hot broth and stare out the window. Across the street, a man is fixing a bicycle indoors. The wheels keep turning long after he's stopped pedaling. It seems metaphorical. Your radio crackles to life with a cheerful broadcast about weather, sheep exports, and a stern reminder that importing beer is still illegal. The voice is calm, reassuring, possibly drinking a gin and tonic. Here's your obscure tidbit. In the 1980s, Icelandic bartenders became experts in mixing vodka with malt extract and soda to create fake beer cocktails, often presented with patriotic names like Viking Foam or Icelandic Gold. Some were decent. Others tasted like betrayal and toothpaste. Scholars still debate whether this era counts as the low point or the high comedy of Icelandic beverage history. You take a sip of your wine. Start. Complex.
Remarquably Humber-like.
And you toast silently to contradictions, to quiet defiance, to this little island that outlawed lager but let the schnapps flow free. You wake to snow. Not a storm, nothing dramatic. Just a calm, deliberate snowfall that's been working quietly all night, carpeting the roofs and muffling the sidewalks. The whole town feels tucked in. Even the birds seem hesitant to chirp too loudly, as though Iceland might roll over in its sleep. You brew your morning coffee, light a small oil lamp, and glance at the window ledge where a few flakes have wandered in and stayed, politely, like well-behaved guests. Today is beer day, or it will be someday, but not yet. Here's your historical fact. March 1st, 1989, marked the official end of the Icelandic beer ban. After 74 years, Parliament finally lifted the prohibition, allowing regular-strength beer to be legally sold and consumed. The change was driven by shifting public opinion, rising tourism, and the logical realization that banning beer while selling whiskey had become, well, awkward. But right now, in your sleepy 1970s Reykjavik, that day is still distant. Instead, you spend the morning writing postcards. One to a cousin in Akureyri, one to a friend abroad, one to the Danish fishermen, though you don't know their address, so you just draw a little boat and hope for the best. The radio crackles again. Today's program is a cooking segment. The host recommends boiling lamb in juniper and pairing it with something celebratory, but discreet. You can't tell if this is code. You step outside for a walk. The snow hushes your footsteps. Here's your obscure tidbit. Before the ban was lifted, Icelandic artists and writers often used beer as a symbol of both rebellion and nostalgia, slipping it into poems, paintings, and novels as a quiet protest. One famous play featured a ghost who returned not to haunt, but to sip a single pint of lager he never got in life. Historians still debate whether that play was political satire, gentle comedy, or both. You keep walking. The snow continues, unbothered, decisive, And somewhere in the white quiet, you start to imagine the sound of a cork being gently removed from a cold bottle. Afternoon arrives, wrapped in wool and smelling faintly of cinnamon and thawing mittens. You're in a cafe now, a real one. Narrow, wooden, full of old books and mismatched chairs. The windows steam up from inside as the scent of cardamom buns and chicory coffee coils into the corners. It's not crowded. A few writers, a retired librarian, a man drawing an accurate map of the Faroe Islands on a napkin. You sit near the stove. Your coat drips gently onto the floor, and your coffee is served in a mug that has clearly seen things. Here's your historical fact. Even after beer was legalized in 1989, strict alcohol regulations remained in Iceland. Beer could only be sold through state-run stores, known as Venbin, and advertising alcohol was heavily restricted. To this day, public drinking laws remain some of the tightest in Europe. So beer returned, but not with fireworks. More like, with a whisper. You sip your coffee and eavesdrop gently. The librarian is discussing yeast cultures with the barista. The writers are arguing over adjectives. The Faroese cartographer has moved on to sea monsters. A waiter drops a tray. It lands with a clink that's suspiciously familiar. Someone chuckles. Here's your obscure tidbit. During the final weeks before the beer ban ended, some Icelandic bars staged elaborate countdowns, offering pre-legalization pints poured at the stroke of midnight. Technically still illegal, but widely tolerated. One bar even staged a funeral for the ban, complete with candles, a eulogy, and a cake shaped like a lager bottle. Scholars still debate whether this was civil disobedience or just very on-brand Icelandic humor. You stay a while longer, not because you need to, but because the cafe feels like the kind of place that remembers and forgives, and occasionally stashes a six-pack behind the chessboard. You pull out your book. Read the same page 3 times. Let the steam from your cup fog up your glasses. And think, maybe history doesn't repeat. Maybe it just ferments quietly. Evening settles in like an old sweater, soft, oversized, and slightly unraveling at the cuffs. You're home again. The fire is crackling in a way that suggests it's feeling poetic tonight. Outside, the snow has stopped. Everything is covered in a faint bluish hush, like the world's been lightly erased with a clean rubber. You set your boots to dry near the hearth. Unwrap a piece of leftover flatbread, and pour yourself, well, let's say a historically relevant beverage. You sip slowly, as if centuries were tucked into each drop. Here's your historical fact. The original beer ban was extended several times, most notably in 1935, when spirits and wine were re-legalized but beer over 2.25% alcohol remained forbidden, due to lobbying from temperance advocates and fear that cheap beer would lead to widespread drunkenness. This twist effectively gave stronger liquor a legal head start of 54 years. Yes, that's right. Whiskey was welcomed back with open arms, but beer had to sit outside, thinking about what it had done. You flip through a dog-eared newspaper from the 60s. The editorials are passionate. There are letters to the editor about sheep farming, fishing rights, and, yes, beer. One man writes that banning beer has kept our souls sharp. Another counters, "My soul is sharp enough. I'd like a pint." The fireplace pops approvingly. Here's your obscure tidbit. In the 1950s, some Icelandic travelers brought beer back from Europe in disguised thermoses or labeled it as dark tea concentrate in their luggage. One infamous bottle was hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible. A customs official allegedly said, "Well, at least it was the New Testament." Historians still debate whether that's apocryphal or just very Icelandic. You lean back, let the heat from the stove warm your toes. It's not rebellion, it's comfort, and sometimes those are nearly the same thing. Later that night, Reykjavik slips into a dream state. Windows go dark one by one, like an old-fashioned switchboard being shut down for the evening. Somewhere nearby, a snow shovel leans against a wall, having finished its shift. A dog barks, but politely. No one answers. You stand at your window for a while, watching, thinking, feeling perhaps just a little bit smug about the perfectly legal glass in your hand. Here's your historical fact. By the late 1980s, Icelanders drank far less alcohol per capita than many of their European neighbors. Not because they had fewer vices, but because the ban created a quiet culture of moderation, DIY ethics, and, well, resilience. Beer became a symbol of not just fun, but fairness. It stood for all the little things people were told they couldn't have, which, of course, only made it more appealing. You turn away from the window and glance around the room. The kettle is steaming. The armchair sighs as you sit back down. On the floor, a curious cat noses an empty cork. She's judgmental as always. Here's your obscure tidbit. In the final years of the beer ban, some cafes printed fake beer menus filled with nonsense names, Nordic Thunder Ale, Einar's Secret, as a kind of satire. They'd serve tea or soda in beer mugs, just for the symbolism. One of them even held mock tasting nights, with boiled barley water and dramatic notes like hints of glacier and regret. Historians still debate whether these events were anti-establishment gestures or just an excuse to gather and laugh. You lean back, let your eyelids drift a little, and somewhere between a blink and a breath, you imagine the first legal pint of Icelandic beer being poured. Not in defiance, not in anger, but with a small, well-earned smile. Morning again. You wake to birdsong, quiet, tentative, the kind that sounds like it's checking the weather before committing to a melody. Outside your window, the snow has softened into slush. The rooftops drip steadily, like overturned teapots. A bicycle passes by, tires slicing through puddles, its rider wrapped in layers of wool and mild optimism. Today feels lighter somehow. Or maybe it's just the memory of last night's perfectly legal sip. Here's your historical fact. After the beer ban ended in 1989, Iceland saw an immediate and enthusiastic response. Bars introduced beer menus. Local brewers began crafting lagers with almost spiritual care, and imports flooded in from Europe. The beer culture that had been stifled for decades re-emerged with a kind of quiet glee, like a hobby horse taken out of storage and proudly trotted through town. You wander through the city's quieter lanes. The post office has a new poster, Beer Day Approaches. It's printed in 3 fonts, none of them confident. At the corner cafe, the special is a beer brat sandwich. You order it without asking questions. Inside, the walls are decorated with framed bottle caps and old cartoons poking fun at the ban. One shows a Viking chugging vodka while kicking a barrel of beer into the fjord. It's a little on the nose, but you smirk anyway. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some families celebrated Beer Day by opening bottles they've been hiding for years, aged lagers stored in cellars, behind false pantry walls, or, in one instance, beneath a stack of National Geographic magazines from the 70s. A few bottles exploded. Most were flat. All were shared anyway. Historians still debate whether those beers tasted good or just tasted like freedom. You finish your sandwich, leave a generous tip, step back into the thaw, and notice that someone has written, in condensation on a cafe window, "Free the pints, but keep the peace." Afternoon again. The sky is gray, but not sullen. More like a well-meaning uncle trying to remember your birthday. You've wandered into a small museum tucked behind the harbor. Its windows are foggy, its gift shop oddly fixated on puffin keychains. But it's quiet, and warm, and smells faintly of old wool and dry wood. You step through the exhibits. One display shows a lineup of state-issued alcohol ration cards. Another features a rusted bottle opener labeled, "Smuggled in a Boot, 1961. A third features 2 unopened bottles of Danish beer, dusty but dignified. Their sign reads simply, "Patient guests." Here's your historical fact. Before the ban lifted, Icelandic travelers often drank their beer abroad, in Copenhagen or London or Berlin. Some claimed the beer tasted better there, not because of the hops but because of the freedom. This led to a kind of beer tourism, with certain flights nicknamed lagerliners for their thirsty passengers. The museum has a small listening station. You put on the headphones. A scratchy recording plays. It's a 1970s radio host reading letters from listeners on both sides of the beer debate. One writes, "Beer is the language of fools." Another responds, "Then I'd rather be fluent and friendly." You smile. Sit a moment longer. Here's your obscure tidbit. In 1989, as part of Beer Day festivities, one Reykjavik bakery made a cake shaped like a beer mug, with layers of vanilla sponge, apricot jam, and whipped cream foam. It was declared both delicious and confusing by the local paper. Historians still debate whether it was meant as satire or celebration. You leave the museum with a tiny puffin magnet and a new sense of calm. There's something oddly comforting about a country that debated beer with more care than most people debate politics. You walk home slowly, not because you're tired, but because the streets, now damp and echoing with thaw, seem worth savoring. Evening again, and Reykjavik is glowing dimly, but earnestly. Street lamps hum to life. Storefronts reflect off damp sidewalks. Somewhere nearby, someone is playing a gentle accordion tune that sounds like an apology and a lullaby stitched together. You pause beside a familiar shop window, fogged over from within. Inside, a bartender polishes a row of newly legal pint glasses. He's humming along to the accordion. You don't go in. You just stand for a moment, watching, listening, feeling the soft thud of history settling into something gentler. Here's your historical fact. After 1989, Icelandic breweries began to flourish. Small craft labels emerged with names like Viking, Kaldi, and Einstock. They brewed in garages, old barns, and sometimes in former fish processing facilities, where the smell of hops eventually overpowered the ghosts of cod. The beer wasn't just a drink. It was a restoration of culture, of ordinary joy. You pass by a row of recycling bins. One is overflowing with green glass. That, too, is history in the making. Here's your obscure tidbit. One of the first television commercials to feature beer in Iceland showed nothing but a glass being filled.
No voiceover.
No music. Just the quiet glug 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 of amber liquid, ending with the word akelti, gratitude. Viewers called it more moving than most dramas. Historians still debate whether it was sincere or simply Icelandic advertising doing what it does best, being quietly weird. You keep walking. There's a cat trailing behind you, probably the same one from last week. She wants nothing, offers nothing, but approves of your pace. It's snowing again. Not heavily, just enough to soften the edges. And now the beer is back. But no one is shouting, just sipping, as if the past had finally loosened its collar. Night now. Quiet, heavy, safe. You're home. The fire has been kind. The walls are warm. There's a coat drying near the door and a half-eaten cinnamon bun on the table, looking proud of itself. You light a candle, sit down, and take a slow, curious breath. Here's your historical fact. March 1st, Beer Day, is now a casual national celebration in Iceland, not a riotous one. There are no parades.
No fireworks.
Just friendly gatherings, local brews, and a raised glass or two. The kind of holiday you almost forget until it shows up with a six-pack and a grin. You leaf through an old photo album. Black and white portraits of people holding things they weren't supposed to have. One man holds a bottle of Guinness wrapped in a sweater. A woman, grinning, pours something unlabeled into a coffee cup. They look happy, or maybe just amused. Here's your obscure tidbit. In 1991, a Reykjavik poet wrote a sonnet cycle about the end of the beer ban. One line read, "The hops returned / like old lovers / unsure if they were still welcome." It won no awards, but it was printed in full in the local paper beside an article about road salt. Historians still debate whether it was good poetry, but everyone agrees it was timely. You stretch. Outside, the snow falls thick and slow. Inside, everything has finally quieted. The ban is over. The spirits survived. And beer, humble and foam-capped, is no longer a symbol. Just a drink. Cold one. You finish your tea. Blow out the candle. And the cat, now claiming your bed, does not move to make room. The house is still now. There's a soft hush blanketing every surface, like history has been tucked in for the night. The fire has dwindled to glowing embers. Even the snow outside seems to be falling slower, more politely, as if aware someone might be trying to rest. You lie back, eyes drifting toward the ceiling, where shadows of candlelight once flickered. You made it through the day, through the ban, through the quiet revolution, and now you rest in a country that once believed beer was too rowdy for its own good, but still threw parties for schnapps in the meantime. Here's your final historical fact. Today, Iceland's beer culture is not only legal, it's thriving. Reykjavik hosts an annual craft beer festival. Homebrewers experiment with glacier water and wild herbs. One brewery even aged beer in barrels buried in volcanic ash, because of course they did. The ban is a memory now, but the creativity it sparked never quite left. You shift under your blanket, pulling it up to your chin. Here's one last obscure tidbit. During the beer ban, some Icelanders brewed their own in bathtubs, using baker's yeast, malt extract, and hopeful math. The results were famously unpredictable. A good batch could taste like a crisp pilsner. A bad one might taste like regret in liquid form. Historians still debate whether those brews were acts of defiance or just boredom on a snowy night. But either way, someone had to clean the tub. And now, as the clock ticks gently toward sleep, You feel the story folding itself up around you. The old debates, the secret sips, the soft return of something once forbidden, now familiar.
No fireworks. No chairs.
Just a faint clink of a glass, somewhere in memory. You close your eyes and drift. Sleep comes slowly, like snow drifting down an empty Reykjavik street. There is no rush now, no band to lift, no speeches to make. Only the quiet hum of a house that remembers laughter and candlelight and cold drinks made warm by company. The past has settled like dust on a bar shelf, unbothered, a little sticky, and oddly comforting. Let your breath slow. Inhale the faint scent of pine smoke, citrus peel, old paper labels. Exhale the noise of the day, the noise of decades, even. Let your thoughts drift, like bottle caps floating in a spring thaw. Let your limbs go soft, like a snowbank under moonlight. Let the hush of history soothe you, gently, gently. You are safe now. The laws have changed. The beer is legal. The cat has claimed the pillow. And the night at last is yours. Outside, the city sleeps. Inside, so do you. And somewhere in the hills, perhaps in a warm kitchen, someone else lifts a glass. Not to celebrate, not to rebel, but simply to enjoy. A quiet toast. To patience. To peculiar laws. To the long, strange journey of ordinary things. Good night, traveler. May your dreams be brewed slowly and served warm.